Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Access Insights Report 2025, published by Disabled Students UK. My name is Prav, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Community Officer at DSUK, and I'll be supporting today's event. Just a visual description of myself. I'm a woman of Indian descent with dark hair, black glasses, and wearing a white hoodie, and I have a British accent. We're really pleased to see such a wide range of people here today, including disabled students, university staff, policymakers, and sector partners. Before we begin, I want to share a few access notes. Can we go to the next slide, please? This event has closed captions, which can be found by clicking on the three dots at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, and captions will be enabled. So if you have any issues with that, please let us know. We've got two of our BSL interpreters today. We've got Andre and we've got Every, who are spotlighted for those who are required in today's event. This event will be recorded as it is shown right now, and a recording will be shared afterwards. If at any point you miss something or you need to step away, please don't worry, the materials will be available after the event. There are a lot of people today, so if you wish to speak during the event, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. And you can also use the chat at any point during the event as well. We'll be monitoring it and we'll bring any discussions later on in the event. If you need to take a break, arrive late, or leave early, please do so freely. We will have a comfort break around 1:15, but there's no expectation to stay for the full event. So if you experience any access issues or tech issues during the event, myself and Emily, who's also on this call, will be able to resolve those issues. And finally, a quick note on tone. This report will contain experiences that may be difficult or familiar to some people. And we just ask everyone to engage with the discussions respectfully and to approach them with openness. And with that, we're going to hand over to Mette to introduce Disabled Students UK and set the context for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Prav. Hi, everyone. My name is Mette. I'm the founding director of Disabled Students UK. Let me do a quick sensory description. I am a white person with shortish hair in my early 30s. My accent is a mix between Swedish, American, and British English. I use all pronouns. Thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to engage with this report. Before I talk about the findings, I want to say a little bit about who we are and why this work exists. Disabled Students UK is the UK's largest disabled student-led organization. We exist to ensure that disabled students' lived experience and insight directly informs how our higher education policy, systems, and practice are designed. Everything we do is led by disabled students, grounded in evidence, and focused on changing systems rather than asking individuals to cope better with barriers that shouldn't be there in the first place. The annual Disabled Student Survey is a core part of that work. This year's survey includes responses from over 1,100 disabled students across 110 different UK higher education providers. It is the largest data set of its kind in the UK, and it exists because disabled students' experiences need to be more visible in institutional decision-making. Running the survey each year is a collaborative effort, and I want to start by offering some sincere thanks. First and foremost, to the disabled students who took the time to complete the survey. Many did so while managing access barriers, ill health, and academic pressure. Sharing these experiences is not easy, and we don't take that contribution lightly. I also want to thank Snowdon Trust for funding this work. Their support has made it possible for us to run the survey at this scale while maintaining its independence and student-led approach. Snowdon Trust does outstanding work supporting disabled students and we're grateful that alongside their grants and scholarships, they've chosen to invest in the annual Disabled Student Survey and the collective evidence it provides to the sector. Finally, we also thank the universities, student unions, and student activists who've helped disseminate the survey and encouraged participation. You make this survey what it is each year. The context for this report is complicated. UK higher education is under significant financial pressure. Disability declarations continue to rise, and many institutions are trying to do more with less. At the same time, disabled students are waking up to their rights, and their tolerance for unreliable systems is decreasing. That tension runs through this year's findings. There are three key findings I want to highlight today. First, satisfaction is improving, but disruption remains high. The National Student Survey shows us that satisfaction has increased for both disabled and non-disabled students, and this is also reflected in our survey. Students express more positivity overall about their experience than in previous years. However, for disabled students specifically, this does sit alongside persistent barriers. Data from the Higher Education Policy Institute in 2025 shows that disabled students are almost twice as likely to consider withdrawing. 1 in 5 of our students, our survey respondents, indicated that they've already switched courses, interrupted their studies, or left their institution at some point, specifically because of inaccessibility. Positivity alone is not preventing harm. Secondly, personalized support is valued, but it's becoming less common. Disability services remains the most positively rated support function within institutions. 80% of students who met with a disability advisor found them knowledgeable and helpful. While most students in our survey are still being supported by disability services in some way, a smaller proportion than previous years are now accessing formal, personalized support from them. Fewer students have met with a disability advisor, and the proportion of declared students with a support plan fell from 77% last year to 66% this year. This may signal a shift toward more informal or automated models of support under capacity pressure. This model may reduce friction for some students, but for others, particularly those with complex needs, it risks reducing access. Third, progress in universal design is uneven. We are seeing real progress in some areas of universal design. For example, the proportion of students who felt that their modules are designed with accessibility in mind has risen from 19% in 2023 to 33% this year. Digital accessibility is another area that continues to improve. But progress is not consistent. Distance access to teaching is declining year on year. Physical access remains a major barrier. 45% of students with physical or sensory access needs are unable to attend some in-person teaching because locations are inaccessible. Assessments remain a significant source of disadvantage, with nearly half of disabled students believing that they have received a lower mark due to inaccessible assessment. Running through all this is a consistent theme. Access fails not because of a lack of goodwill, but because systems are unreliable. Students are still required to chase support, to explain themselves repeatedly, to escalate issues at a personal cost. A majority of students with support agreed do not get all their support delivered. Only 32% of students who escalated an access issue felt heard. These barriers are not inevitable. Each year, our university comparison identifies institutions that are achieving strong outcomes in different areas that we examine. Progress depends not on exceptional effort, but on a willingness to seek support, share learning, and adopt approaches that are already working elsewhere in the sector. The good news is that we're seeing growing commitment across the sector to disable students' access. An increasing number of universities are signed up to the Disabled Students Commitment, signaling a willingness to move towards responsibility for disabled students' experiences. Several universities have also chosen to engage more deeply with our data through Access Insights membership, which allows universities to receive institution-specific analysis and support. This is a promising sign showing a growing willingness across the sector to look honestly at what the data is saying. That momentum matters, particularly in the context that the sector is currently operating in. This report does not call for new principles or more consultation. Disabled students are clear about what they need. The findings point to the importance of delivery, universal design, clear ownership, reliable systems, and accountability. Disabled students are not asking institutions to do everything at once or to be perfect. They're asking for systems that work reliably without requiring them to chase, escalate, or absorb harm when access fails. They're asking for accessibility to be treated as a core part of educational quality, not an add-on that depends on individual effort or exceptional practice. So today we want to move beyond statements of principle and ask some practical questions. Where does responsibility for disabled students' access actually sit within institutions right now? And where should it sit practically if accountability is going to be meaningful? In the context of financial pressure, what does it mean to move beyond compliance-driven approaches and invest in systems that are sustainable? And what does it take for disabled students' voices to lead to real change? How do we signal to students that it's worth raising issues? These are not abstract questions. They're questions about delivery, ownership, and trade-offs. We're looking forward to hearing how our panelists think that the sector can respond to this data in ways that are practical, accountable, and meaningful for disabled students. Now let me hand back over to Prav to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Metin. That was very insightful. So we're going to introduce our panelist right now. So firstly, we've got Suzanne, who is the head of student equality and welfare at the Office for Students, the regulator for higher education in England, if you did not know. Suzanne leads on access and participation, including for disabled students. She's helped set up and is the deputy chair of the Disability in Higher Education Advisory Panel. She is also a member of the Disabled Student Commitment Advisory Group and the Department for Education's Higher Education Mental Health Implementation Task Force. Next slide, please. Secondly, we got Jim, who is the associate editor at Wonky and leads on their work with student unions. He has a particular interest in student experience, university governance, and regulations. His career background is in support for student leadership. He has also had senior roles at the National Union of Students, where he led on student SU development, campaigns, and political strategy, and is the former student union CEO, where he provided management strategy for the union's charitable and commercial vehicles, as well as policy support for their elected student officers. Jim has served as a governor and a trustee for further and higher education and the voluntary sector. Nextly, we've got Helen, who is the chief executive of the Snowdon Trust. She brings extensive experience in charity leadership and fundraising. Under Helen's leadership, the Snowdon Trust champions direct support for disabled students and wider systematic change and is at the forefront of advancing disability inclusion in higher education. Helen has overseen the development of the Disabled Leaders Network, a pioneering community supporting emerging disabled leaders to develop skills, grow influence, and advocate for disability inclusion in professional and academic settings. And Snowdon Trust also proudly funds the DSUK annual Disabled Students Survey. Helen is committed to building a more inclusive system and creating opportunities for disabled people to thrive in education and beyond. And that in mind, we also have our panel host today, Amelia, who I will pass on to right now.
A very brief visual description. I'm a deathly white woman wearing dark rimmed glasses and has dusty brown hair. Now, how this panel will be conducted today is we have a few starter questions, which I will go to each one of our panelists in turn for each one of those questions first. Just for clarity, Suzanne, you are up first, just to give you some warning. We will then open up to the other panelists for each question, but please do put any questions you have in the chat, and if there is time, we will ask your questions to the panel. So firstly, who is ultimately responsible for maintaining accountability for disabled students' experiences in higher education, and how can institutions ensure that responsibility is embedded at senior leadership level rather than diffused across departments? And we will go to Suzanne first. Thank you.
Thank you. As a visual description, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair and wearing a red top. Ultimately, higher education institutions are responsible for ensuring that they support disabled students to have the education that they deserve and that they have been promised. They're responsible for this, I think, in primarily three ways. Firstly, they have legal responsibilities set out in the Equality Act that includes both a duty to make individual adjustments and a duty to anticipate the needs of disabled students. Secondly, in England, the higher education regulations are clear that all higher education providers must provide high quality education, and the regulation is framed around some broad objectives that are to ensure that all students can benefit from higher education, and that obviously includes disabled students. And the regulations set out a number of conditions that relate to aspects of that, including quality of education and the support to engage with education, and particular responsibilities for universities and colleges charging higher fees to take proactive steps to widen access and ensure support for students. That includes evaluating what they're doing and learning from that work and improving it as they move forward. And then finally, they have a set of contractual and moral promise agreements that they have made with students that are important, both in a legal sense in terms of contracts. If you have promised to deliver something, then you should deliver that support, but also important for reputation and important for the sort of social contract that universities and colleges have with the public in general. Ultimately, the senior leadership in the university or college is responsible for ensuring that there is a clear strategy, there are clear priorities, and that everybody understands that and can be part of delivering that. But it has to be a shared endeavour across everybody in the institution. So it's everybody's job, but ultimately it's always a leader's job to drive that forward.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. I will invite our other panelists. In the interest of accessibility, I will quickly call on each panelist to see if they would like to contribute, just so there is no crosstalk, and we can ensure proper BSL and captioning for those that are watching. So I'm going to go to Jim first. Do you have any further comments on this question?
I wasn't expecting you to come to me next. So I'm Jim from Wonky. I am a white man who's now in his 50s, which is very upsetting. I have very short hair, I'm wearing a stripy t-shirt, and I have a Bronx accent. I mean, look, the reality, there's lots of ways to sort of attack this question. The reality, I think, in this piece of work and lots of other pieces of work, if you answer the question, who is responsible right now, there's absolutely no doubt that right now, it is the student that is responsible for chasing, re-advocating, constantly having to sort of battle, whether we're talking about, the disabled student allowance systems or these systems. It is students that end up being the people responsible. And in some senses, there's nothing wrong with that. All educational outcomes are co-produced. I think my issue is that to the extent to which education is supposed to be a partnership, it is hard to see that at systemic level, that the sector overall is delivering its side of the bargain for disabled students. And its side of the bargain, as a minimum, should be those things that we're familiar with in the Equality Act, with some maximums, ideally. I just want to say two other things on this question. One of the things I guess that you're supposed to do if you're a panelist is you start by saying, really great to be here. Thanks for the invite. Really impressive report. And it is, and it is, and it is. But one of the things that I would say actually is I'm actually fairly miserable about being on this panel, partly because one of the things that I've been doing is looking at lots of other systems across Europe with different legislation and different processes and so on. And some of the conferences and some of the events of this sort that they have on the disabled student experience. And put it like this, I would love to be on a panel where lots of this kind of basic stuff was fixed, but we were talking about some of the thornier issues, perhaps for PGRs or international students or work-based learners, or for example, disabled student access into Erasmus Plus now that we're rejoining the student mobility scheme. The fact that we're not able to get onto some of those thornier issues and the fact that we're stuck here on the basic really is upsetting. And for me, it speaks to a really interesting question, which is back on accountability, who feels accountable? And at every level, it's clear that people don't feel accountable. It's clear that from this evidence and from repeated other evidence that academic staff don't feel accountable. And that's probably because there's very little risk to not delivering on the reasonable adjustments that are set out. It's very clear that accountable officers, that's vice chancellors in universities, do not feel any sense of threat from the regulatory system. It's very clear that these issues are owned by the EHRC, which doesn't really regulate higher education with any passion, partly by OFS, which only regulates outcomes rather than processes. And then, if I was one of the regulators or one of the funders around the UK, if I was, MEDA or the Office for Students or whoever, I'm clearly not really feeling much pressure on this from the Department for Education either. One specific thing, though, that I would say is that my sense is that the regulatory design is fundamentally flawed. And I just want to, I won't take up any more time, let the rest of the panel speak, but I just want to quote something just for a second from the Office for Students Regulatory Framework. So the framework that was published 7-8 years ago says that OFS's approach will seek to deliver social and policy objectives in areas where the market may not succeed. For example, the improvements in access that students and society require will not be delivered by the market, and that means OFS will take direct regulatory action to drive improvement in this area. I think part of the issue is that whilst it does on outcomes, it absolutely doesn't on these issues. It's not taking direct regulatory action to drive improvement in this area. And unless and until it does, I suspect that we are not going to see the sort of progress that we need to see.
Thank you for that, Jim. Just to note, you are coming out a little bit quiet in comparison to the other speakers, so feel free to raise your voice a bit louder on the next question. Indeed. I'm also going to invite Helen to answer this question. However, given the topic of this question, I would like to give Helen the opportunity to maybe talk a bit more around the Snowdon Trust, its aims, and how it supports disabled students in education, rather than necessarily accountability being the focus. So if Helen, if you would like that opportunity, please do unmute yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen from the Snowdon Trust. I am a white woman, also now in her 50s. Jim, I share your pain on that. I have blonde hair and I'm wearing a blue jumper and a pink and blue shirt. Share a lot of Jim's frustrations, but actually I'm also, while I agree with him that unfortunately too much of the accountability does rest with disabled students, it feels very important then that this research exists to be able to showcase those views. And I think for me, one of the big challenges in terms of this accountability and oversight that comes through from the report is really the challenge of escalation, and how few disabled voices are getting through to that level of accountability. And actually, what we're finding in terms of the Snowdon Trust's response here, last year we had almost 1,000 applications come through to our services, and that's almost 1,000 examples of barriers still going on in higher education for disabled students. And that's just not good enough, because actually most of the time lots of the things that the students are asking for from us are things that are their legal right in their institution. And it's very difficult finding ways to fund those things that are the legal responsibility of other institutions. And I think just one more thing is really thinking about, in terms of that accountability, we talk a lot about the legal and reputational risks to institutions, and the hope that that should be something that drives change. But I think we need to never forget the human side of that. And actually, I'm far more concerned about the risks when access repeatedly fails, the consequences for individual disabled students, which, if not profound, can be tragic.
Thank you for that, Helen. The second question I am going to read out. I believe it will be on the next slide. So next slide, please, for whoever is behind my camera. But just for kind of this question, will go firstly to Helen again, then to Suzanne, and then to Jim. That is the order I will offer your spaces out to. And the next question is, what does meaningful co-production with disabled students look like in practice, and how can universities ensure that student voices lead to tangible change rather than consultation fatigue? Sorry, I cannot say that word today. Hopefully you got enough of it on the screen. And I will go to Helen first.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, student voice, I think, is probably the area that I feel most strongly about on this panel, and certainly most able to talk about. We have too many conversations with disabled students, and read too many funding applications who are frustrated, and that's too small a word for it, about the barriers they encounter over and over again, and who have constructive advice about resolution, which is ignored or rebuffed. And I think we need to move from endless sort of consultation opportunities to real co-ownership, really, that drives that change. And it's why the report is so important. I mean, it's great progress that 49% of students feel that their institution listens to disabled students, but that means that there's another half who still don't. And so, I think there's lots of progress that can be made. I mean, I think there should be disabled student advisory groups in universities, not as a lip service exercise, but give them real budget and give them decision rights. I think you need to pay members for their involvement because that's fair, but it also means that you can hold that group accountable like any other member of university teams. This isn't a group that wants favors. We're talking about the implementation, I keep saying this, of legal responsibilities. And I think there needs to be evidence of progress published as much as can be done. And that kind of covers milestone achievements, but also there just needs to be some communication. I think the other thing students need is to be able to report when they're not getting the support they need, so that it's easy to resolve. We get way too many applications for support from students who are being pushed from one provider to another. I mean, we literally get applications from students with the evidence they provide includes emails from their disability team saying, tell Snowdon we'll only pay for X, and then see if they'll pay for the rest. And that all of that does is it forces students to go backwards and forwards. And use this survey, use the data from our applications, which we're trying to get better at publishing, because they're a real national barometer of the problems.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. I'm going to go next to Suzanne, if you would like to speak on this topic.
Thank you. I think listening to what Helen was saying, there's two levels here, isn't there? One is about involving disabled students in the decision-making process about systems and processes and what's broader kind of strategic level thinking that's really important and can really help to make sure that the solutions that we put in place are right and are going to help. And then, but the other level that's also really important is the individual level. So thinking about how do we work with students to make sure that we are centering their understanding of their needs on a day-to-day basis, and involving them in that as well. I think both things are really important, and one without the other is not enough. It's not easy though to do the first part, the involving people meaningfully in decision making, and I think that's important to recognise, not least because people's experiences are different and the intersections of experiences are important to recognise and reflect on. And not everyone can engage and participate in the same way. And there are always going to be challenges that universities and colleges are going to have to try and face in thinking about how they make that co-production meaningful. That's not to say they shouldn't do it, but I think it's really important to think about who's not in the room as well as who is in the room. And to continually challenge yourself and think about how you can strengthen that further.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Suzanne. Going to Jim finally for his comments on this question.
Am I at the right volume this time? Is that a bit louder? Or shall I just talk louder?
I think you just talk louder, Jim, to be honest,
Right, okay.
which is not something you often get to do. So I would relish it.
No. What I would say about this question actually is I'd actually like, and I've done this a few times on the site, I'd like to draw an arguably moderately arbitrary, but nevertheless, a distinction between the kind of voice that we might need when we're making improvements over the baseline, kind of quality enhancement, nice to haves, things that would make it even better for disabled students, and then the kind of systems, processes and support you need when students are raising the fact that their legal rights aren't being met, the minimums, if you like. Because the reason I draw that distinction is it seems to me that almost all student voice in higher education in the mental map gets defaulted into the nice to have. But these are legal rights. And when you've got students whose legal rights aren't being met, you need different processes. You don't need lots of committees. You don't need lots of consultation. You need systems and processes that make sure that those minimums are being delivered. Let me just say a few things about what we've seen in other countries that help to deliver that. The first is that if I was a student in Poland, by law, my students' union has a duty to tell me what my rights are. And there's a whole section there on disabled students. And that's very interesting because that means that disabled students get to understand their rights. And it means that non-disabled students get to understand the rights of their colleagues. And that really matters because so much learning in higher education is social learning. So a proper understanding of your rights when you join, the world of being a student, I think is absolutely crucial. The second thing, though, is about process design. And what I would say about this is most people in universities, if they've got a problem with estates, so if the heating isn't working in their office, or if they've got a problem with their computer, if, for example, Windows won't boot up, there's normally a ticketing system. And one of the things that the centre can then do is check that whether those tickets are being escalated, whether there are common problems across the institution, either in IT and so on. And to some extent, some of the comments that then come through that ticketing system are a type of voice. That's the sort of thing I would like to see over delivering the baseline minimums. That kind of systemic way of checking that students' rights are being met. But one other thing that I would say, one of the things about being a disabled student, if you get a reasonable adjustments plan, is effectively you're getting an extra part of your student contract. You're getting a kind of extension to the student contract. You're getting a set of bespoke promises. The thing that I find astonishing is almost no universities routinely and systemically, halfway through and at the end, ask the question, is this working for you? And then at the end, did this work for you? If institutions did that, we wouldn't be forced into having conversations, and don't get me wrong, this is a great event, but conversations that extrapolate out slightly too far from the reality of what's happening on the ground. If that survey went out to every student with a reasonable adjustment plan halfway through semester one, you could get rapid follow-up, you could get prioritization of the rapid follow-up, you could very, very quickly be able to go and fix the things that are students' legal rights. And it's that kind of process work that I think the people who are paid an extraordinary amount of money to lead higher education institutions, that's the sort of thing they should be thinking about to justify earning the big bucks.
Thank you for that, Jim. Really insightful. As we are at a significant moment in our launch, we are going to break for now. If I could pass to Pav to explain the criteria of the comfort break, and then we will return after that with our first speaker, that will be Deborah Johnson. But yes, a 5-minute comfort break is coming. Prav, if you would like to explain that. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And yes, we will now be taking a 5-minute comfort break. So feel free to jump off this call and come back if you feel like to, or stay on the chat during the break. And just feel free to ask any questions, or if you have any insights from what was discussed, please also share them in the chat. So we'll return around 1:20 for the second part of the panel discussion. Okay, so I will now introduce Deborah. So Deborah is the Professor of Development Economics and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Academic Framework at London South Bank University. As a person who stammers, Deborah is a trustee for Stamina, the British Stammering Association. She was awarded an MBE in recognition of her work to make higher education more accessible for students who stammer. Deborah obtained principal fellowship of the Higher Education Academy and currently chairs the Disabled Student Commitment Advisory Group. She has recently been selected as one of the 20 Disability and Access Ambassadors by the government. Deborah is also a member of the Office for Student Disability in Higher Education Advisory Panel. Now we're going to pass it back over to Amelia to start the second part of the discussion.
Thank you, Prav. Next slide, please. We are going to go on to the next question. So, cognizant of the current financial climate, how can universities move beyond compliance-driven approaches to disability and develop long-term adequately resourced strategies that treat accessibility as core to educational quality and sustainability. Now, for this question, we will warmly invite Deborah Johnson to go first, followed by Suzanne, Jim, and then Helen. So please, Deborah, take us away with the answer to this question.
Thank you, Amelia. And so a short visual description. I'm a white presenting middle-aged woman, still just about in my 50s. And I have longish white hair, and I use the pronouns she and her. And so this is a really important question. And I'm thinking back to the way that Meta framed this current moment in time of universities generally and across the board feeling resource constrained. And as someone who's involved in encouraging universities to sign up and to adhere to the disabled student commitment, I think in those behind the scenes conversations that we have with senior leaders within universities, the difficulties of making change in a moment of financial constraint often comes up, and I really want to turn it on its head. And I think it is about reciting that apparent trade-off, the sort of trade-off that might be assumed by many within the sector, that actually moving towards long-term adequately resourced strategies is somehow at odds with financial constraint. And there are lots of ways where that isn't true. And I think that's, if we think about the fact that for very many disabled students, when we look at the complaints that arise, and when we look at what disabled students tell us about the barriers that they face, reducing some of those complaints and removing those barriers can be done in ways that either are resource saving or are resource neutral. And I want to give some examples of this because it's a really important point. So if we think about the uncertainty that disabled students face when asking for reasonable adjustments around particular assessment approaches, that uncertainty is not in itself inherently linked to a resource pool. It is due to a lack of clarity. Similarly, if we think about the additional burdens that disabled students face, having to frequently restate the nature of their disability for different university services, that in itself, reducing and simplifying those information flows can actually be reducing costs within the university. And so there are lots of ways in which reducing the burden on students, be that having to ask for reasonable adjustments, having to have those reasonable adjustments work through a course team rather than finding that they are anticipated and they're built into courses. Lots of those improvements would actually be about resource improvement, or they would be resource neutral. And if we think about those sorts of wider impacts on finances, the fact that the impact of having environments that are not working for disabled students, and the impacts then on those students being unable to complete their course or transferring to other institutions, and there's really clear evidence on that from the DSUK Access Insight report. Actually, these are ways in which institutions are harming themselves financially by not moving to adequately resourced environments. And so I did want to start out, and I know I've spent a lot of time doing that, but I think it's really important to sort of absolutely head on take a story about being unable to afford adequately resourced strategies to instead turn the question on its head. Can institutions afford not to have adequately resourced strategies? I do think then we then do need to talk about actually how do we make sure that resources are allocated in ways that meet students' needs and are effective. And that comes back, and I'm sure the other panelists will want to talk to this, and I know it comes back in some of our later questions, but that is very much about having an evidence-led approach, the kind of approach we see in the DSUK Access Insight survey.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Deborah. And if I'd like to go to Suzanne to follow on the discussion.
Thank you. I agree with what Deborah was saying wholeheartedly. I also think that there isn't a tension between ensuring there is compliance and having a successful business strategy. Those things shouldn't be in opposition. I understand what you mean by I think a compliance-driven approach, which is often a sort of maybe a tick box approach or a minimal approach. But actually, compliance, it should be at the heart of the university or college's strategy, making sure that they are meeting their legal duties and their regulatory requirements should be a really core part of what they are trying to do in their business model. So I don't think there needs to be a tension between those things either. I think there are some really tough choices that universities and colleges are having to make at the moment. And we see that as they tackle with financial challenges. And actually today I published a blog that highlights some research we did with students looking at their experiences of those financial cuts and changes to deal with financial pressures. I think what's really key and relates to what we talked about just before the break is making sure that students' voices are heard early in those discussions and that they are included so that we can really understand the impact of potential changes on students and that we find ways to make those changes that minimize negative impacts and also, as Deborah was saying, where possible, move to models that are actually more supportive of students overall as well.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Jim, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, just a few things on this. On compliance, if you think about the prevent duty, or you think about the stuff that's happened over the past few years on freedom of speech, even if you think about changes to the immigration rules that impact international students, what you tend to see is ministers, government officials, people from the Department for Education and the other department, that, depending on the issue, regulators and representatives of the sector in a room having an argument about the compliance regime. And that means that when a backbencher says, how are you making sure this happens? They've got a viable answer. That isn't happening over this set of issues. These people are not in a room. There is not a coherent compliance regime. And that's one of the things I think we need to see. But just in terms of strategy and investment, at every level, I think there's something interesting that could happen. If I was the Department for Education now, given the huge rise in the number of young people that have got EHCPs, you know, to the extent to which I'm now having to do a kind of major review and look at that regime in schools, I'd be having urgent and serious conversations with colleagues in the sector about the implications then for higher education when those students reach higher education. It's not clear that that's happening. If I was UUK, every time I was calling for extra funding for higher education, I'd be highlighting this as a particular need. That isn't happening, or at least there's no evidence that it is. If I was the Office for Students, when the Office for Students looks at whether or not an access and participation plan is realistic and viable, one of the things in theory it does is assess whether or not an institution has set a realistic budget for that work. If, of course, these issues around meeting access basics were in access and participation plans, then there could be a serious conversation about whether an institution had invested enough. But fundamentally, at the university level, I just want to say this. The approach of developing a reasonable adjustments plan fundamentally is about the idea that there aren't many disabled students and they're all different. But once you get to the sort of volumes of disability declaration that we now have, we have a much better understanding of disability than we ever used to. What that does is, it means that you have to change your approach. It doesn't just mean funding lots and lots more disability advisors and lots more individual adjustments, although that would be very welcome. It means that once you're in an academic department where 30 or 35% of students are getting a particular adjustment, you have to spot that and you have to convert that into standard practice. That's the theory of universal design for learning. And my theory is that universal design for learning is seen as a kind of pedagogical niche area rather than a piece of institutional strategy. On these volumes, the sector has to sort of change its approach. But then just one other very brief thing. One of the things that is characteristic of the UK system is that we ram students through at top speed. Our bachelor students, our undergraduates, for example, complete their bachelors faster than anyone else in Europe. And the reality is that the number one adjustment that is given to disabled students is extra time. Extra time on an exam means that you lose 45 minutes in the pub with your colleagues. But extra time on every piece of continuous assessment eats into your social life, eats into your ability to earn extra money, eats into your ability to then cope with an increasingly efficient student life. My sense is that unless at macro level, the student finance system's assumptions of pace don't change, we are going to continue to have the problems that we have.
Thank you for that, Jim. And finally, but not least, Helen.
I would say excellent points made by my fellow panelists. Nothing to add.
I must admit that was quite hard to follow. Apologies for that, Helen. On to our next question. Just to remind anyone, I would just like to remind people in the call that you can submit questions to our panelists. So if you do have any, please do pop them in the chat and we will hopefully get to them by the end of this session. But the last question we have, if you would like to go forward to the training question. Thank you. What cultural and structural barriers prevent disability-related training from translating into consistent, inclusive practice across teaching, assessment, and student services? And how can institutions address these at scale? To answer this question, we will be going to Jim first, then Deborah, and then Suzanne. So, Jim, if you would like to kick us off with this answer.
One of the things that I did this morning was look at 3 different universities' compulsory induction training if you're a new member of staff, okay? And actually, they were, all 3 were basically exactly the same. So in there was introduction to the prevent duty, health and safety training, a basic broad introduction to equality and diversity. There was stuff on information security. There was lots and lots of things that were very much about compliance. This stuff wasn't there, and that would help if it was there. And you know, I've probably answered in other questions why I think it's not there. The other thing that strikes me is if you've been in an institution for a long time, and either the law or our interpretation of the law off the back of things like the Abrahart case changes, then you have to update your understanding of some of these things. It's not just an induction question. And again, it's not clear that has happened. But fundamentally, the thing that I would say is, if you go back to that thing I was talking about earlier, which is your nice to haves and your compliance, it is clear that there are some types of training in institutions that are in the compulsory basket and some that are in the, if you have time, you can opt in basket. And I think the key issue for me is when it's optional, you send the signal that it's optional. When the training's optional, you send the signal that the delivery of the reasonable adjustment is optional. And that, I think, you know, that signal sending, regardless of the actual quality of the training, is a massive problem. One other brief thing, if we trained students, not just disabled students, as I said earlier, on their rights as part of their half of the partnership, I do think that would make a huge difference.
Thank you for that, Jim. And Deborah, would you like to follow?
Yeah, and absolutely coming in. And just to say, there are institutions that are making training around the Equality Act duties, particularly with regards to disabled students, mandatory. And that is one that we will be able to start to actually say, look, it's possible. And that's a really important thing in the sector. So, but, I want to go further than that. And I want to talk about this element to do with teaching and assessment, and the way that practices of teaching and assessment really need to be challenged in terms of often the ableist approaches that are built within them. So absolutely, Jim's right. It's about the right training and the right indicators at the level of institutions. But there's also something about disciplines and professions, thinking about actually the norms that they establish. And this is really important because, again, when I read what disabled students are saying about their experiences, some of the things that seem most intractable and most create the most uncertainty are those pieces around assessment for particular kinds of courses. So I'm thinking about medical, vets, those sort of professional and technical courses where, some disciplinary groupings are not engaging at all. And so I think we do need to also have a real commitment by professional, statutory and regulatory bodies, those disciplinary and professional groupings, about the way they support colleagues to understand what it means to teach and assess in their subject. So I'm an economist. What does it mean for me teaching economics? If that's in any institution, what does that mean for me? And how can I release myself from those old-fashioned notions of the way that teaching and assessment has to be, and actually widen my thinking? And that's really important from an academic point of view. And I would love to see more professional bodies, more disciplinary bodies engaging in that. Again, there are some examples. Let's sing about them, let's champion them, but I'd like to see it be widespread.
Thank you for that, Deborah. Really interesting. And finally, but not least, Suzanne, if you would like to come in on this.
Thank you. I agree with what Jim and Deborah both said. I think I'd like to add, in relation to the training specifically, thinking back to points that have been raised earlier on today, part of what we need to do is make sure that the training is really practical, that it allows and enables all staff to fulfill their duties easily. So that means, yes, absolutely, making it compulsory for staff, and there needs to be some jeopardy if that is not done and if those processes are not followed, frankly. But it also means that we need to think about what support and processes need to go around the academic teaching students or the disabled, the disability service or other services supporting students, to break down those barriers that are preventing things working well. So most academic staff want to support their students. They want to do the best for their students, and they want them to succeed and learn and thrive in their course. They also are often working with very high workloads, and with workload models that define the amount of time they have to prepare for a particular course that is often unrealistic. In those circumstances, it can be really difficult for academic staff to know what they need to do and to be able to do those things. And while it is absolutely every individual lecturer's responsibility to make sure that they are doing the things they need to do, it's also the broader university's responsibility to make sure that those things are actually achievable, and we're not just creating huge amounts of stress and unrealistic expectations on staff, some of whom will be themselves disabled. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is really important is that we build up the evidence base about the impact of different types of interventions, so that we understand what works and we understand what the impact of different approaches is, because that will help to win the case, embed support, get people on board with it, but will also help to make sure that what we are putting in place and what we're advocating for is helping students and isn't unintentionally causing harm, which is always a possibility with everything we do. So I think the two things are really important. Practicable training that is easy to follow, and increase in evaluation and understanding of impact, including, as was said earlier today, by talking to students.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Suzanne. So now we are going to take some questions from the room. So bear with us. As we don't have them on the slides in preparation, one of my colleagues will be putting the question repeated in the chat for people to read. So if for extra accessibility, but I will read out the first question. Almost clairvoyantly from Suzanne's comments, we have a question that notes, do you have any examples of where anticipatory adjustments have worked well or could be considered if not already? It would be great to know if there are any suggestions we may not have considered. I will go to Deborah first for this question, if that is okay.
So the sorts of examples are, I mean, actually, let's take those difficult pieces around those professional and technical degree programs. And I know within LSBU, and there are some, within London South Bank University, and there are some colleagues on the call from London South Bank University. One of the things we've been trying to make sure is that we're really clear at the start around occupational structured clinical assessments, the OSCEs, which are used as forms of assessment in very many of those health-related programs, that there is already built in the potential for additional time or other kinds of reasonable adjustments built into them. And I know that for some of those courses, we've been able to build out better clarity, and that's working with the professional body that accredits them. And in those cases, I think it's been helpful for the students involved to know that they can have, and in this case, it is talking about extra time, and very well aware that's only one element of a reasonable adjustment or of an anticipatory adjustment for a student. And so I think that's where those sorts of changes being built in to the forms of assessment that are available for a course in advance can be really good in terms of reducing uncertainty. And so from my perspective, it is very much about that reduction in uncertainty and that clarity for students as they enter a course, as they look at the modules they're going to be doing in a particular year.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And I would like to especially thank you, Deborah, for highlighting healthcare aligned students. That's a cohort that doesn't often get the visibility it perhaps should. I would like to go to Helen for this question as well, just to highlight perhaps the support that Snowdon has been able to provide in this area and any good practice they have to offer perhaps to the sector. Not to kind of build you up and put you on the spot too much, Helen, but I think that would be a really interesting perspective to give to this question.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that the support we provide is anything but anticipatory. So we're very much the funder of last resort. So students come to us when all of the support mechanisms that they had hoped for have failed. And the challenge we have is that our programs remain consistently oversubscribed. So in many cases, we're turning students away as well. So in that sense, I have very little good practice to share in terms of anticipation, I'm afraid to say.
That's still a good point, Helen, that like there is other sources, but perhaps we should be looking more at the core kind of provision that we should be giving disabled students. So thank you for that. Jim, do you have any quick words on this before we move on to one more very quick question?
Yeah, I'm actually just going to cheat on the question. One of the things that is quite interesting about some of the national bodies across continental Europe that combine research into the experience of disabled students and then kind of practical support for both academic staff, the sector, and particular subject disciplines, which is a real issue that that Deborah's highlighted, is that, that there's a focus both on experience and outcomes. And one of the things that strikes me is the equality function in advanced HE doesn't seem to be anything like as important or strategically kind of prioritised as it was 10 or 15 years ago. And of course, you know, I've said before on this event, one of my critiques of the OFS approach on access and participation is it tends to focus on outcomes rather than experience. And you know, as we've said before, one of the interesting things I think about disabled students is that quite often outcomes are comparable, but experience is worse, and that's not really good enough. My point is that between all of the bodies that we have, you know, there's a what works function, the OFS funds in TASO, there's Advanced HE, there are national bodies. I think if some people got in a room and said to themselves, how can we consistently gather this evidence on anticipatory adjustments, innovative practice, the sorts of things that some people are doing that others aren't doing, what challenges there are in particular subject disciplines. If those people were in a room asking themselves, how do they, you know, sort that out? We'd be able to answer the question, what sorts of anticipatory adjustments have you seen that are working that we might have missed? It'd be much easier to answer that question. And for me, it's about putting ourselves in a position where that question is much easier to answer.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Jim. I would say that is one of the core principles of why we even have the survey and built the surveys to try and get closer to some of that data that you were referencing. Our last question, and this will be a quick fire round before we close, but a very interesting question we have got from an audience member. Is what do you believe the most effective channels are for effective culture shift in UK universities in relation to disability support are? What would it take? So basically centered around culture change for the universities themselves. And I will come to Deborah first, if that is okay.
Thank you, Amelia. So I do think it is about, you know, clear holding to account by DfE and the Office for Students, and I think there is also something, you know, going back to those disciplinary and professional spaces. I think that we've got to ask ourselves: are we allowing, you know, the right diversity of people to train as architects, as vets, as medics? And that's a really important question for us as a nation. It's at that scale.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Deborah. I will, for a 30-second comment, if I may, Suzanne, if you want to reply to that, just to close the loop on that comment.
Thank you. I agree. I think it's clear that where there is a tension and where there is a focus from the regulator and from government on these issues, that will drive action. We published our strategy in the autumn, and in that we said two things. One, that we said many things, two things that are relevant here. One, that we are going to think about equality of opportunity as part of all of our regulatory work and all of our duties. And secondly, we set out a number of attitudes about how we are going to work with the sector. And we've said, for example, we will be vigilant. We will watch for where there are problems in the sector, and we will be vocal about those problems. We will also be vocal about what the sector is doing well. And we talked about being collaborative and wanting to work with the sector. I think it's important to note that within the past year or so, a bit less than a year, we published a blog where we highlighted the issues for disabled students' experiences from the NSS, and we noted the range of issues that we as the regulator are seeing. We also published an insight brief where we set out the range of experiences and the challenges we were seeing for disabled students' experience. And we have had a disability in higher education advisory panel working with us to look at the range of issues and to help us think about how we can best work with the sector to address these issues. So I think it's important to note that we do take this seriously, and we are looking at this. But I think there's an important role for us to work together with the sector on this, and that's how we will continue to work.
Thank you so much. It's very encouraging words. Thank you, Suzanne. I would just like to thank all of our panelists for an amazing conversation, and especially for keeping the student voice alive and well in such a process-driven conversation in light of this report. And on that, I will hand over to our closing remarks to Meta, our CEO of Disabled Students UK.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you so much to our panelists. This has been such an interesting conversation. I have learned a lot. There's a lot of threads that I'm going to be kind of spinning on after this. Thank you so much for kind of engaging so thoughtfully with the findings. It's been amazing. And thank you everyone who joined us today. What this report shows very clearly is that disabled students are not asking for perfection. They're asking for systems that work reliably, for responsibility that's clear, for accessibility to be treated as part of educational quality rather than an exception or an afterthought. We are seeing progress in some areas, and it's important to acknowledge that. And we're also seeing a persistent gap between commitment and delivery. Those gaps continue to drive disruption, exhaustion, and withdrawal for disabled students. Closing them requires more than good intentions. It requires ownership, follow through, and a willingness to design systems that don't rely on disabled students having to fight for access. This report is intended as a tool for reflection and action. For institutions, we hope it supports an honest conversation about where responsibility sits, what needs to change, and what's realistically achievable under current constraints. For policymakers and regulators, we hope it provides evidence of where accountability and oversight matters the most. And for disabled students, we hope that it offers reassurance that their experiences are being taken seriously and represented collectively. If you would like to explore the findings in more depth, the full report and university level results are now available on our websites. Disabled students can also sign up there to become contributors to the 2026 Annual Disabled Student Survey, helping ensure that these findings continue to reflect lived experience across the sector. We also encourage everyone to sign up to the newsletter to stay connected with this work. Universities that are interested in engaging more deeply with data can find information about Access Insights membership on our website. And for disabled students specifically, we'll be hosting a student discussion on the results next month, creating a space for us to reflect together on what this means, and what the data means, and what should happen next. We have put all these links in the chat. And finally, I would be very thankful if you would leave feedback on this session through our feedback form. We're always looking to improve. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to all of you for being part of this conversation. It's been a really good one.